Habíamos mencionado en el tema anterior el origen de la esclavitud. Dijimos, ¿no es cierto?, que cuando se producía excedente, ya entonces había posibilidad, entre otras cosas, de tener más comida, más posibilidades de que sobreviviese más gente, y entonces los prisioneros eran transformados en esclavos. I mentioned in the previous blog that when a surplus appeared, there was the possibility, among other things, of having more food. More people could likely survive, and prisoners were turned into slaves. The slave system arises where we have the master who is the owner of the slaves. Not only is the owner of the land and the means of production, but also the owner of his workers. In fact, he purchased them like any other object, as if buying a machine or a tractor. In this system, men and women were purchased, transformed into workers subjected to a master. There were slaves that not only worked the land, but also slaves who worked rowing in the galleys, and some who were put to work in the domestic service. At the time, they were considered just another tool, a machine that needs to be fed, as the locomotive I spoke about earlier is fed, with coal to produce the steam that makes the engine run. This also happened in the case of slaves, since they had to be given something to eat and a minimum rest period to enable them to have the energy to continue working the next day. We said earlier that exploitation hasn't always existed, but that it arose at a specific moment in history, when the means of production began to be appropriated by a group of society. Another form of exploitation of human labor is what we has been called the servile mode of production, which has been linked often to the word feudalism. What happened in feudalism? Large landowners, called feudal lords in the Middle Age area, has immense lands that were the product of military conquest. And for these lands to produce, they needed people to work on them. What did they do to achieve this? The peasants that inhabit this territory were allowed to stay on their lands on the condition that they work for the feudal lord for free. This situation later evolved. Sometimes, instead of paying with work, the peasant paid with products. He handed part of the harvest to the owner of the land. As these peasants had the means to survive without having to work for someone else, they could cultivate their piece of land. To make them work the land against their will, the power of the Lord was required. Law, repression, and so on. This doesn't happen in the case of capitalism. Here, the workers, having no means of production, freely offer their labor to the capitalist as the only way to survive. But this relation of dependence with the feudal lord has not been the only form of servitude. Other forms in the so-called Asian societies have existed. The sovereign was the owner of all the land. He claimed he owns the entire country and demanded a tribute from peasants who live in that territory. In other cases, he made them work domestically at his service, or he made them work on great projects such as irrigation work or big constructions. Egypt was a typical example of Asian servitude, or Asiatic mode of production, as some have called it. The pharaoh, who it was said represented the divine power soul, made his subject work in irrigation work to take advantage of the waters of the Nile, the famous river in Egypt. And you remember the famous Egyptian pyramids? Those huge buildings of mankind were constructed in that way. Those workers had their piece of land to survive, but they had to give part of their working time to the pharaoh. In Latin America, we had the Incan and the Aztec system. Many times people speak superficially about primitive indigenous communities. Everything is mixed up, and a not clear difference between the indigenous communities and this more organized and complex system is made. In the Inca or in the Aztec system, there was a kind of Asian mode of production. The Incas were owners of the land, and the indigenous peasants cultivated the land for them. There was no fair distribution. Social classes were already present in those systems. The indigenous leaders had palaces, much superior condition of life than the indigenous peasants who worked the land. They were paid in tribute. They were a privileged caste. That is why it is said that when the Spanish conquest arrived, it was easier to conquest those places where indigenous societies had social classes than where the indigenous communal system still existed. Summarizing, in all the systems of production that we have analyzed above, when the means of productions are in the hands of a select group of persons, between the owners of the means of productions and the workers, a social relation is established, a relation of exploitation. Then, when we study the relations that are established between human beings, depending on the relation they have with the means of production, we can distinguish two kinds of relation. The relation of exploitation that we have seen before, and the relations of mutual collaboration. Those last ones are the relations that are present in the communities where there is no private ownership of the means of production, and everything that is produced is shared in common. We will call social relations of production the relations that are established between individuals depending on the relation of ownership or absence of ownership that they have with the means of production. Previously, we talked about the relationship of control or domination over the means of production that are set out in the process of work, which we call technical relation of production. When we talk about relations of production, we are talking then of the two relations, the technical relation of production and the social relation of production. Marx's great contribution was understanding that this relation of production are what define the fundamental feature that constitutes a society at a given moment of its development. The relations of production permit us to classify societies as slave, feudal, Asiatic, capitalist or socialist societies.